A federal court delivered a significant blow to President Trump's trade agenda this week. The important ruling came on Wednesday, May 28, 2025. The U.S. Court of International Trade in New York issued this impactful decision. It effectively blocked the president's ambitious plan to impose massive new taxes on imports. These proposed tariffs would have affected goods coming from almost every country around the world. The court clearly found that Mr. Trump had overstepped his legal authority in this matter. This judgment was a pivotal moment, scrutinizing the extent of executive power in trade policy and bringing relief to many businesses. The core of the court's reasoning centered on the misuse of a specific law. President Trump had invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, commonly known as IEPA. To justify the sweeping tariffs, he declared a national emergency. However, the three-judge panel determined this was an overreach of the powers granted by IAEA. The court scrutinized the administration's justification for the emergency declaration very carefully. They concluded that the circumstances cited did not meet the stringent criteria required by the statute for such drastic economic measures, especially concerning long-standing trade patterns rather than sudden crises. The court's decision specifically blocks the tariffs that President Trump had announced earlier in the year. These included far-reaching taxes intended to apply to imports from a vast number of nations. The scope of these planned tariffs was quite extraordinary in recent American history. The administration's stated aim was to fundamentally reshape global trade dynamics and protect U.S. industries. Despite these intentions, the legal foundation for implementing these specific tariffs via IEPA was found to be insufficient by the court. This ruling therefore halts the immediate imposition of these particular widespread import taxes, pending any successful appeal. This significant ruling immediately sent ripples throughout Washington, D.C. and across global financial markets. It served as a stark reminder of the system of checks and balances inherent in the U.S. government. The judiciary effectively stepped in to adjudicate a major policy dispute with profound economic implications. This was not the first instance of the Trump administration facing legal challenges to its trade policies. However, this particular ruling was notably sweeping in its impact on the specific tariffs justified under the IEPA, signaling a critical juncture in the ongoing debate over presidential authority in international trade. The president's tariff plan, now blocked, included several key components announced on April 2, 2025. Among these were what the administration termed reciprocal tariffs. These could have been as high as 50% on goods from countries with which the US currently runs a trade deficit. This concept of reciprocity was a central tenet of President Trump's broader trade philosophy aimed at leveling the playing field. However, the implementation of these specific reciprocal tariffs had been suspended by the president for a period of 90 days. This suspension was intended to allow time for negotiations, but the underlying threat of these high tariffs remained a significant concern for many international trading partners. Alongside the suspended reciprocal tariffs, the April 2 announcement also included a more immediate measure. This was a baseline tariff of 10% set to apply to imports from almost all other US trading partners. Unlike the reciprocal tariffs, this 10% baseline tariff was not suspended and had been put into effect. This widespread levy immediately caused considerable concern among businesses, both domestic and international. Companies began to urgently calculate the potential increased costs to their supply chains and consumer prices. The broad application of this baseline tariff, affecting a wide array of goods, became a major source of contention and legal challenges. The court's ruling on May 28th also extended to other tariffs imposed earlier in 2025. Specifically, it blocked tariffs that President Trump had levied in February 2025. These earlier measures had targeted imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. President Trump had justified these tariffs, much like the April ones, by invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. His rationale for these specific tariffs on neighboring countries and China was linked to what he described as a national emergency. This emergency was defined by the administration as the illegal flow of immigrants and drugs across US borders. a justification the court ultimately rejected for these trade actions. The Trump administration consistently argued that persistent trade deficits were evidence of unfair international trade practices. They believed that imposing tariffs would compel other countries to change their policies and thereby correct these perceived imbalances. For the February tariffs targeting Canada, Mexico, and China, the justification shifted towards national security concerns linked to border integrity. However, the U.S. Court of International Trade explicitly noted that U.S. trade deficits, which have been a feature of the economy for 49 consecutive years, do not constitute a sudden emergency, as envisioned by the IEEPA statute. This finding substantially undermined a critical pillar of the administration's legal justification for these sweeping tariff measures. The legal challenge against President Trump's tariff plan was robust and came from multiple fronts. The court's pivotal ruling actually combined two distinct lawsuits that had been filed. One of these cases was initiated by a group of 5 small businesses. These businesses argued compellingly that they would suffer direct and severe economic harm if the proposed tariffs were implemented. The second case consolidated into this ruling was brought forth by a coalition of 12 US states. These states contended that the tariffs would inflict broader economic damage within their jurisdictions, affecting employment and state revenues. This alliance of small businesses and states represented a diverse range of interests unified against the tariff measures. The central legal argument presented by the plaintiffs and ultimately accepted by the U.S. Court of International Trade was that the president had exceeded his statutory authority. The court found that President Trump's actions in imposing such sweeping tariffs were problematic. The judges stated clearly that these tariffs went beyond the authority granted to the president to regulate imports under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The court emphasized that IEPA was not designed or intended to be used for such broad and general imposition of tariffs, particularly when not linked to a clearly defined and sudden international emergency as stipulated by the law. The ruling underscored the legal limits on executive power in this specific area of trade regulation. The court further elaborated on why these particular tariffs were deemed an overreach of executive authority. A key point in the ruling was the observation that the tariffs, as structured and justified, did not adequately address the problems they were ostensibly supposed to solve. For instance, the court questioned the use of IEPA and Emergency Powers Act to address long-standing issues like trade deficits. The connection between the declared emergency, such as the flow of drugs or immigrants, and the imposition of widespread tariffs on global trade was considered tenuous by the panel of judges. The specific nature of an IEPA qualifying emergency was central to their reasoning, and the court found the administration's application too broad and inconsistent with congressional intent. It is important to understand the constitutional context surrounding tariffs and trade. The U.S. Constitution fundamentally grants Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, which includes setting tariffs. Over many decades, Congress has delegated some of this authority to the president under specific statutes and conditions. However, this delegation of power is not unlimited, as the court's decision reaffirms. It is also crucial to note that this ruling does not affect all tariffs implemented by the Trump administration. For example, existing tariffs on foreign steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain in place because they were invoked under different legal authorities, typically requiring extensive investigations by the Commerce Department, rather than discretionary presidential action under IEPA. The court's decision to block President Trump's tariff plan had an immediate and noticeable impact on U.S. businesses and international relations. Many companies, both large and small, had expressed deep concerns about the potential negative effects of these broad tariffs on their operations and costs. Wendy Cutler, a respected trade expert and vice president at the Asia Society Policy Institute, provided insightful commentary on the situation. She stated that the decision throws the president's trade policy into turmoil. Ms. Cutler also suggested that U.S. negotiating partners might now choose to delay making concessions in ongoing trade talks, and companies could be prompted to reassess their global supply chains due to the heightened uncertainty. Further expert analysis underscored the significance of the ruling regarding the scope of executive power. Eswar Prasad, a distinguished professor of trade policy at Cornell University, offered a pointed assessment. He commented that the ruling effectively destroys the Trump administration's rationale for using federal emergency powers to impose tariffs. Professor Prasad also emphasized that the court's decision makes it clear that the broad tariffs imposed unilaterally by Trump represent an overreach of executive power. This judicial intervention serves as a potent example of the checks and balances designed to ensure that presidential actions, particularly in the complex arena of international trade, remain within legal and constitutional boundaries. Looking ahead, this ruling carries significant implications for how future presidents might attempt to use tariff powers. It specifically clarifies the limitations on invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as a primary tool for imposing widespread tariffs. Future administrations will likely face increased legal scrutiny and potential challenges if they try to implement similar measures using IEPA without a more clearly defined and appropriate emergency. However, it is important to remember that the president does retain some authority to impose tariffs under other laws. For example, the Trade Act of 1974 allows for more limited and targeted actions, such as tariffs of up to 15% for a maximum of 150 days, under specific conditions related to large and persistent trade deficits with particular countries. This avenue for tariff imposition remains, though it is considerably narrower in scope. The tariffs that were overturned by this court decision had already begun to cause considerable disruption before they were even fully implemented, or in some cases while they were briefly active. They had an unsettling effect on global commerce, contributing to volatility in financial markets worldwide. There were widespread concerns among economists and business leaders about the potential for these tariffs to lead to higher prices for consumers, disrupt supply chains, and increase the risks of a broader economic recession. While the court's decision provides some immediate relief, the legal process may not be entirely concluded. Decisions from the U.S. Court of International Trade can be appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington, and potentially thereafter to the Supreme Court. The final chapter in this trade policy saga may still be unwritten.
I hope you found this video useful. Follow me right here on YouTube for more great content daily. Download my international best-selling book, Be Good, Be Brief, Be Gone, for absolutely free at growfast.club. I say again, download my book at growfast.club for all of my 7-figure growth hacks. Get your copy now while it's still free.
There it is. Magnum. Holy moly.
Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for!
Dear God, it's beautiful.